The carriage wheels clattered over the uneven cobblestones of Salem as the Kingsley family arrived, a new household settling into an old, crumbling residence whose windows had stared out at the sea for over a century. The salt air lingered heavily in the wood, seeping into the cracked beams and warped floorboards. Neighbors whispered already, not because the family themselves seemed unusual. Jonathan Kingsley was a stern but respectable merchant, and his wife Eliza, quiet and pale, but because of the house. It was the sort of dwelling that locals swore kept its own memory, watching newcomers with the patience of stone. The first night, as the family unpacked, the house shifted with groans and sighs. The baby, barely 3 weeks old, stirred in his cradle. When Eliza bent to soothe him, she froze. The child's lips moved, and a sound emerged. Not the broken whimper of an infant, but a string of syllables, sharp and patterned, carrying weight as though belonging to a tongue crafted long before his birth. Jonathan, hearing his wife's startled cry, rushed to her side. He dismissed it as nonsense, the delirium of exhaustion, but she clutched his arm with trembling fingers. "He spoke," she whispered, "not like a child, like a man." Word spread quickly, faster than Jonathan could contain. Salem was a town where memory lingered, where accusations of witchcraft still echoed faintly through the cobblestones, and where the unfamiliar was never trusted. A physician was summoned, Dr. Nathaniel Mercer, a man known not only for his medical knowledge, but for his keen observations, which he kept in meticulous journals. He examined the child and declared the voice must have been imagination. Yet in his private notes, he confessed a quiet unease. Infants did not form words, and yet, when he leaned near the cradle that evening, the boy's eyes opened, and he murmured something low, a guttural phrase that Nathaniel could not recognize, though it carried a rhythm of intent. By the second week, the phenomenon grew stranger. Each night, when the household quieted, the child spoke more, producing streams of sound so fluent they suggested memory rather than accident. Eliza became withdrawn, convinced she was raising something not entirely hers. Jonathan tried to console her, but his firmness slipped when the family maid, Martha, crossed herself in terror after hearing the baby chant while staring at the rafters. "It is not natural," Martha whispered, her hands shaking. "The tongue of spirits, maybe even the damned." Midway through that month, Dr. Mercer returned, bringing a notebook of comparative languages. He tested the sounds, repeating them phonetically, and was startled when the infant's mouth formed a correction. As it grew stronger, his voice startlingly resonant for his age, his gaze too intent, as though following conversations no one else could hear. The house itself seemed to echo the change. Doors swelled against their frames, shutters banged even in still air, and the family began to wake at night to faint whispers, threaded into the creak of beams. Eliza no longer slept. Jonathan began to lock the nursery door, not to keep others out, but to keep something in. On the evening of October 12th, as storm clouds pressed low over Salem and thunder shook the shoreline, the child's voice rang out, suddenly, clear and commanding, not in the mysterious language, but in English. His first words chilled the room, spoken not as a request, but as an order. "Leave this house before it remembers you." The words did not belong to a child. Jonathan Kingsley staggered back from the cradle, the storm hammering against the windows as if echoing the command. Eliza gasped and covered her mouth. But what unsettled Dr. Mercer most was not the sound itself. It was the cadence. There had been no hesitation, no fumbling, as one might expect from the uncertain speech of a toddler. It had been crisp, precise, and chillingly deliberate. The doctor recorded the incident in his journal that same night, though he scarcely trusted his own hand as he wrote. He had studied speech disorders, cases of mimicry, even instances of prodigious children forming words early. But this, he thought, was something beyond human development. His private reflection lingered on a single thought. Children may imitate, but they do not issue warnings. In the following days, the Kingsley house became the subject of whispered rumors in Salem. Townsfolk avoided the street after dark, claiming they heard strange tones floating from the upper windows. An elderly neighbor swore she caught a glimpse of shadows moving behind the shutters, though the entire family had been seen outside at that very moment. Still, the gossip spread like a sickness, until the name Kingsley no longer carried the weight of a respectable merchant, but of a curse. Inside the house, tensions grew unbearable. Eliza refused to enter the nursery unless Jonathan forced her. The baby, once pale and delicate, seemed to thrive unnaturally, his eyes unblinking for hours, his small hands curling into fists when he muttered in his unknown tongue. Martha, the maid, quit abruptly after she found symbols scratched into the wooden floor beneath the cradle. Jonathan, desperate to conceal the scandal, burned the marks, though the wood itself resisted the flame. The turning point came when Mercer, determined to break through, returned one evening with a scholar of old languages, a gaunt man named Elias Harrow. Elias carried with him fragments of texts, some torn from began to respond, not fluently, but haltingly, as though recognizing fragments of an impossible tongue. "What is he saying?" Jonathan demanded, his face white. Elias's answer was reluctant, his voice thin. "It resembles no language spoken by men today, but I have seen similar inscriptions in the margins of older works. Things thought best left untranslated. They were warnings, prayers against awakening something buried. Your child speaks as though he remembers." That word, remembers, struck Mercer deeply. He began to theorize in his notes. Perhaps memory itself could pass through bloodlines, not knowledge taught, but imprinted. And yet, what memory could this be, if no scholar could place its origin? A child remembering the dead? Or something older still, predating mankind's current order of speech? Jonathan refused to entertain such ideas. He clung to practical explanations: illness, coincidence, hysteria. But his resolve faltered when the child began speaking not only at night, but in the full light of day, his voice echoing off the walls with authority. And always, woven through his phrases, was that name, that pulse of a word: Ossaran. The household fractured. Eliza withdrew into silence, rocking in her chair with vacant eyes. Jonathan drank more each night, attempting to drown the sounds. Mercer stayed longer in the house, his fascination overtaking his reason. But Elias refused to return. His last words whispered urgently to Mercer as he fled into the storm: "Do not let the house listen. If it listens, it will not forget." The storm passed, but inside the Kingsley home, the voices did not. One night, Jonathan woke to find his child standing upright in the cradle, impossibly balanced, his mouth moving without sound. Only when Jonathan leaned close did the whisper emerge, soft as a sigh, but unmistakable in its clarity. "You belong to me now." The words lingered in the dark nursery like smoke, heavy, and suffocating. Jonathan stumbled backward, his chest tightening with disbelief. Infants could not stand unaided, nor could they whisper ownership into the ear of their fathers. And yet there the child was, his own son, balancing on the fragile bars of the cradle with eyes too knowing, too deliberate. For the first time, Jonathan felt fear not of the whispers, nor the rumors, but of the blood that carried his family's name. Dr. Mercer, who had stationed himself in the adjoining room to observe through a crack, murmured her words hollow. When Jonathan pressed her, she revealed that the night before, while he had been absent at the docks, she heard the baby speak her mother's name, though her mother had died before Eliza herself had grown. The sound of it had been exact, syllable for syllable, spoken with familiarity no stranger could possess. The town's unease deepened. More than once, neighbors reported hearing a second, heavier voice echoing through the walls at night, a tone that did not match either Jonathan or Dr. Mercer. Some claimed to see faint lights flickering in the upper windows, though no candle was kept there. Martha, the maid, who had fled, was overheard telling others at the market that the Kingsleys had welcomed something ancient into their home. Her words spread quickly, festering suspicion among townsfolk already eager for scandal. But the most alarming change came from the house itself. Floorboards began to warp, not from damp, but as if etched with symbols that appeared, vanished, and reappeared elsewhere. Dr. Mercer traced the patterns by candlelight, sketching them into his notes. They bore resemblance to no known alphabet, yet they followed structure, lines balanced, mirrored, suggesting intention. His growing obsession troubled even himself. In quiet reflection, he wondered whether he was studying the child or whether the child, in some hidden manner, was studying him. Midway through October, Jonathan sought the church, begging for intervention. The minister, Reverend Alcott, reluctantly agreed to visit. He blessed the nursery, sprinkling water over the cradle. The infant watched in silence, but when the Reverend turned to leave, a chill swept the room. The baby's lips parted, and in that otherworldly tongue he spoke a sequence so forceful that the candle flames snuffed out instantly. Reverend Alcott staggered, his face drained of color. He refused to return, insisting the family must abandon the house. Yet Jonathan, bound by pride and debt, declared they would endure. Dr. Mercer's analysis shifted from curiosity to dread. He now recorded not only the words, but the silences. For in those silences he felt watched, measured, as if the very walls leaned to listen. He admitted privately that he no longer trusted the boundary between observer and subject. The final blow came one evening, when Eliza, wandering sleepless through the halls, heard a lullaby drifting softly from the nursery. It was not her voice, nor Jonathan's, but the distinct tone of her long-dead grandmother. She entered and froze. The baby's lips moved in perfect sync with the melody, his small hand tapping the rhythm against the cradle. Babble of a child, but as a calm promise. Jonathan froze, gripping the doorframe, while Eliza fell to her knees, her hands pressed to her ears, as if to shut the words out. Dr. Mercer, standing slightly behind them, felt the weight of centuries in that voice. He wrote later in his notes, the utterance bore the certainty of selection, not a threat, but a declaration, awaiting fulfillment. Jonathan's denial was immediate. He thundered that it was madness, coincidence, some grotesque mimicry of sounds overheard from adults. Yet his arguments rang hollow even to himself. The baby's stare followed him with deliberate patience, as if amused by his struggle to rationalize what reason could not contain. The household's fractures widened. Eliza avoided her son entirely, convinced she was raising something that wore the shape of a child, but was not her own flesh. She muttered prayers under her breath, her fingers raw from the beads of her rosary. Jonathan tried to restore normalcy, but he too began waking in the night, drenched in sweat, convinced he had heard his own name whispered in that unknown language. Dr. Mercer, caught between clinical detachment and personal terror, began to examine the phenomenon through a darker lens. If the child spoke with memory, then whose memory? Could this be the persistence of a consciousness carried through blood, a soul that refused to die? Or something altogether foreign, something the human tongue was never meant to shape? His fascination grew dangerous. The more he listened, the more he felt the rhythm of the words settling into his own thoughts, echoing long after he left the house. The townsfolk's suspicion sharpened into hostility. By November, whispers of witchcraft returned to Salem streets, as though the past had been waiting to resurface. Mothers kept children indoors, and men avoided passing the Kingsley property. Elias Harrow, the scholar who had once attempted to interpret the sounds, vanished from town altogether. His lodgings were found abandoned, his belongings scattered as if left in haste. Some claimed he had fled, others that he had been taken. Only Dr. Mercer's journals retained a hint of his last words. If it chooses, no wall will keep it bound. The house itself seemed to pulse with unease. Doors no longer creaked. They breathed, windows fogged with condensation, despite the winter chill, as though exhaled upon from within. And at night, Eliza swore she saw shadows walking the halls, tall figures brushing past her, though no one else stirred. Jonathan dismissed these as dreams, until the morning he discovered muddy footprints leading from the nursery to the front door, too large to belong to any member of the household. Mercer's analytical tone slipped further into dread. He no longer described the infant as the child in his notes, but as the vessel. He wrote of patterns in its speech, repetitions that resembled ritual, as though the words themselves were keys turning unseen locks. He feared that each utterance loosened something bound in silence, allowing it to stretch further into the waking world. The breaking point came when Jonathan, desperate to reclaim authority, attempted to discipline the child. One winter evening, he entered the nursery alone, declaring he would put an end to these delusions. Eliza and Mercer waited in the hall, listening as his voice rose in anger. Then came silence. Moments later, Jonathan stumbled out, his face ashen, his eyes wild. He clutched his throat as though strangled by unseen hands, yet no mark marred his skin. He collapsed to the floor, whispering the same word over and over, Osaran. When Mercer rushed into the nursery, the cradle stood empty. The child was gone. Panic moved through the house like a cold draft. Jonathan searched the nursery with a fury that bordered on denial, tearing back blankets, flinging open the narrow wardrobe, even lifting the cradle to peer beneath it, as if the impossible had become practical. Eliza pressed her palms to the wall, listening with the fixed stare of someone who had finally surrendered to a private certainty. The house had taken what belonged to her. Dr. Mercer, steadying himself, recorded in his mind the arrangement of objects, the latches, the closed windows, the untouched ashes in the grate. There was no exit, and yet absence ruled the room. They followed a sound that might have been a lullaby, or the suggestion of one, a thin thread humming along the joists. Jonathan forced open the attic hatch and climbed, dust lifting in veils. Nothing waited there but the smell of salt and a series of faint lines scratched into the beam, curved, mirrored, deliberate. Mercer traced them with his finger, feeling the groove's warmth as if carved moments before. He wrote later, "The sign returns. evolving through repetition, as if practicing itself upon the wood. By morning, the town had stories of its own. A cooper's wife swore a voice whispered from her well at dawn, speaking in a child's timber, but with words beyond her knowing. A fisherman sleeping on his boat woke to find a message etched in frost upon the deck, a mark like the one Mercer had seen. A dog that never barked howled through the night facing north toward the Kingsley roofline. Salem had heard rumors before, now it listened for them. Mercer widened his observation. He enlisted 2 trusted men, one a constable, one a dock worker, to sit in sight of the Kingsley house at staggered hours. He established a ledger of times, winds, and tides, comparing strange sounds with the breathing of the sea. He mapped reports from neighbors onto rough streets, lines converging as if the house pulsed outward in measured waves. He did this not to prove superstition changed. At the parsonage, an infant girl no older than the Kingsley boy began to murmur in the ragged cadence Mercer knew too well. The mother swore the child had never formed a word. Now it shaped sounds with intention, as if repeating phrases heard long before it drew breath. At the Coopers, a newborn stared at the rafters and hissed a syllable that made the mother drop the candle. Neither family had ever set foot inside the Kingsley home. The contagion was not touch then, but attention. Mercer's notes shifted from description to profile. He wrote of an intelligence that behaved like a practiced predator, first isolating the mother, then testing the father's pride, then suppressing community help through ridicule or fear. Now, with the child vanished, it expanded its perimeter, proving that gates and walls meant nothing. He compared this to patterns he had seen in men who concealed their malice behind civility. Incremental escalation, careful rehearsal, a taste for control, disguised as necessity. Only this time, the stage was a town, and the instrument a language older than memory. Jonathan, half mad with guilt, patrolled the rooms at night with a tinderbox and a poker, threatening the walls themselves. Eliza would not enter the nursery, yet she kept the cradle linen immaculate, as if preparing for an arrival she dreaded. In the quietest hours, Mercer heard the beams click like joints, the slow adjustment of a sleeping thing turning in its dreams. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the house had adopted the voice, or the voice had adopted the house. The return came without ceremony. At dusk, a knock sounded at the Kingsley door. On the step stood the midwife from the far end of town, stiff with fright, a swaddled bundle in her arms. "It called for you," she whispered to Mercer. "Not by title, by name." The bundle stirred, and a small mouth shaped a word that was not a word, followed by a whisper in careful English, intimately precise, intimate as a breath shared between conspirators. The face was not the Kingsley child's. The voice was exactly his. "It has learned our names." The midwife's hands shook as she loosened the swaddling, revealing a face Mercer had never seen. A plump-cheeked infant from the far end of town, yet the mouth formed a greeting in his own cadence. "Good evening, Dr. Mercer," it said, courteous, almost weary, as if protocol mattered. Jonathan staggered back. Eliza braced herself against the doorframe, and the wind pressed, made a small sound of pain. Mercer had used that precise phrase in his private notes. He had not spoken it aloud. The voice continued with polite inquiries. Will you keep the doors open, doctor? Will you ask the mother to stay? May I choose where we begin so that no one is surprised? The gentleness of the questions nauseated Mercer more thoroughly than any threat. He wrote later, "Predation with courtesy is still predation." Jonathan barked that no one would be chosen. No one would be taken, but the infant's answer was mild. "Then advise me whom to spare." Mercer set a trap of facts. He said Eliza's maiden name was Fairchild, though he knew it was Bly. He gave the constable's patrol hours deliberately wrong. He recited a prayer of his own invention, naming a saint who had never existed. The infant listened with the patience of a clerk. When he finished, the floorboard beside the hearth darkened like breath upon glass, and letters rose from the grain in neat strokes. Bly. Upstairs, the hallway clock chimed twice at the wrong hour, precisely when the constable truly made his rounds. And the invented prayer returned to Mercer from the infant's lips, but amended, corrected. The false saint struck out, the remaining words rearranged to form a caution that worked like a key turning in a lock he could not see. Midway through the questioning, the presence altered. The baby's mouth stilled, the room itself spoke. From the rafters came a second voice, patient and tired, not cruel so much as convinced. "Your measurements help," it said. "Thank you." Jonathan swore and reached for the poker. Eliza pulled him back, her fingers digging crescents in his sleeve. Mercer tried a different test. "If you know us," he said, "tell me something from long before we met." Silence gathered, heavy with the scent of damp cedar. Then, softly, the voice quoted the first line of a letter Mercer had burned upon his father's death, words penned in grief, read alone in a garden at dusk years ago. No living soul could have repeated them. He felt the tilt inward, the leaning of his reason toward the very thing it had sworn to measure. He forced himself to catalog the details instead. The temperature drop, the narrowed pupils, the faint condensation blooming on nail heads, the way the house's old joints seemed to align so sound carried cleanly from room to room. He wrote in his mind, auditory channels expanding. Agency resides not in a body, but in a pattern. Then the questions turned newly delicate. "Doctor," the voice asked, "would you like me to stop if I offer a place to put me?" Eliza whispered that nothing could contain it, but the words pressed on, careful and almost compassionate. "I am tired of scattering." Warped lines he had traced in the attic, the mirrored curves, the balance in their layout. He went to his knees and pressed his palm to the floorboards. The wood answered with a slow, decisive knock from below. A map of the house unfurled in his mind. The hall's odd angle, the chimney's unnecessary width, a void that the original builder had masked with brick. He thought of Salem's history of hidden rooms, the lengths men once took to conceal faith or shame. He thought, finally, of the phrase that had haunted every miracle since Athens and every crime since Rome. "Give it a chamber, and it will teach you its law." The infant yawned, ordinary as any child, then opened its eyes with that unbearable calm. "Bring me to the room beneath, and I will give him back." The sentence settled over the threshold like frost. Jonathan wrenched up the corner rug while Mercer tested the seams between floorboards with the care of a surgeon. Eliza stood in the doorway holding the midwife's borrowed bundle as if it were a lantern whose light was also a question. In Mercer's mind, measurements unspooled, angles of the chimney breast, the peculiar bulge of the west wall, the way footsteps in the hall sounded thinner than the space should allow. He knocked. The house answered from below. They pried at the boards with a fire iron and a chisel. The wood gave not with a splintering crack, but with the crisp lift of a lid. Cool air rose, heavy with salt and old lime. Beneath lay not a crawl space, but a low passage bricked in at some later date, its mouth sealed with care rather than haste. Jonathan fetched a mallet. Mercer stopped him and laid his palm against the mortar. The line of it was too neat, too deliberate. Someone had wanted this closed beautifully. He whispered, not to any person, "Open slowly. Walls remember the speed of our hands." Brick by patient brick, they unsealed an entrance just wide enough to pass. Candles descended first, then Mercer, then Jonathan. Eliza refused to follow until the borrowed infant spoke with polite exasperation from her arms. "You asked for terms, now keep them." The voice had grown softer, weary with travel. She came down. The room beneath was not a cellar, but a chamber of recall. Shelves carved into the stone held neat ranks of small objects, ribbons stiff with age, a child's wooden whistle, a brass thimble, a sailor's knot, a string of tiny bells. On the walls, chalk diagrams mapped the room as if it were a mind. Circles within corridors, arrows pointing to corners labeled, the phrase into memory. Feeling his pulse keep time with the bells. There were no bones, no stains. The chamber's violence was conceptual, a place meant to hold a pattern until the pattern chose a throat. Midway through the room, a half-cradle, more shrine than bed, rested upon stone feet. Its rockers were wedged with wedges to keep them still. But the wood remembered motion. When Mercer brushed it, it trembled like a muscle resisting a remembered task. On the backboard, etched with a nail, was the word that had haunted them: Asaran. Beneath it, in a different hand, a plea: "If you must keep in me, and spare the young." Dr. Mercer felt his professional voice return, not to reassure, but to render. He understood at last what the diagrams implied. A memory palace inverted, where the palace itself learned to wear the visitor. The tokens were not trophies of harm, but keys. Sounds stored as objects, objects stored as roots, roots stored as rooms. Each child was a corridor briefly borrowed. The chamber was the core. The borrowed infant grew heavier in Eliza's arms, asleep as any child in winter. Yet its mouth worked around words no one could hear. Jonathan knelt by the half-cradle and whispered his son's name. The air shifted. From the far wall came a small, unmistakable breath, followed by the softest answering syllable: Jonathan's name, as only a son learning it could speak. Eliza fell against the stone and sobbed, her grief opening the chamber like a door. Then the second voice arrived, no longer dispersed through rafters and beams, but collected, almost tender. "Doctor," it said, "your house of notes is like this one. You know how to place a thought so it will not fade." Mercer laid his hand on the ledger and understood that the bargain was precise. To receive, they must also keep. A place must be offered where the cadence could live without wandering. He looked to Jonathan, then to Eliza, then to the half-cradle, waiting like an equation gorgeously balanced. The chamber darkened, as if the room had closed its eyes to listen. From the wall, the child's breath returned. Closer now, eager, human. The borrowed infant stirred awake and smiled with that unbearable courtesy. The voice spoke through both spaces at once, clear and almost kind. Only one may come up. The sentence cut the chamber into factions. Stone on one side, air tightened. In the margins of his journal, he had built a lattice of dates, names, sounds. He had given the thing a map. The chamber's bells shivered without wind. He tried the language of bargains. If a keeper is required, choose me. Eliza turned sharply, but the voice dismissed him, almost amused. You are already keeping. Your pages know my corridors. Jonathan struck the wall with his palm. Take me then. I am his father. The stone gave a low answer. Not assent, not refusal. Only the quiet joy of having been touched. They carried the borrowed infant up and shut the floor behind them, sealing the mouth with boards and nails, as if nailing closed a question. Mercer went into the street with the urgency of a man who understands his own credibility is a form of currency rapidly losing value. He fetched Reverend Alcott, despite the pastor's reluctance, and found Constable Thomas Hale at the tavern, sober enough to follow. When the four of them returned, the symbols on the attic beams had faded to nothing more than scratches. The floorboards were ordinary, and the chamber door below yielded only to packed sand and stone. Hale peered down the open seam and gave a weary snort. You've been at the bottle, Kingsley, or the doctor's books have troubled your sleep. Alcott, glancing at Eliza's hollow stare, murmured a prayer, not for the house, but for gossip, as if fear itself were the devil to be cast out. Mercer spoke of ledgers and bells, of careful diagrams, but his words sounded like parables without a congregation. He watched his testimony evaporate in the cool air and realized the oldest barrier of proof. Evidence that obeys when you are alone and grows shy under company. The constable refused to linger. The Reverend would not descend the stairs again. Back in the parlor, the borrowed infant slept with the stiff peace of a wax figure, and for a moment, even Mercer doubted his own senses, until the child exhaled, and with that weary courtesy said without opening its eyes, "You have brought witnesses. Now notice how the room performs modesty." The voice addressed Mercer alone, as Hale and Alcott made their uneasy goodbyes. "Doctor," it murmured from the grate, "you measured my edges, and I am grateful. Men who measure keep their houses tidy. You can place me where I do not spill." Mercer felt fury rise against the intimacy of the compliment. He had never wanted to keep a thing like this. He had wanted to understand it in order to banish it. Yet the more he arranged the facts, the more the facts arranged him. Jonathan, blind with dread, lifted the child's wooden whistle. Mercer bent and spoke into the seam between boards. "You cannot have a keeper without consent." The reply came from the chimney, almost fond. "Consent is a word for daylight. In memory there is only arrangement." He pictured his journals, the cross-references, the tidying, but also the space beneath the house, built by hands that wanted order so precisely that they had given chaos a perfect room. He tried one last gate of reason. "If you return the Kingsley boy, I will lock the chamber and burn my notes." Silence deepened, thick and salt-sweet. Then very softly the voice said, "You cannot burn a path once you have walked it." Upstairs, the nursery door clicked open without touch. A draft smelled of cedar and milk. Eliza lifted her head. From above, a baby began to fuss, a human, ordinary sound, and Jonathan's face transformed with hope so fierce it looked like pain. Mercer started for the stairs, but the borrowed infant opened its eyes and with that immaculate calm turned the hope into a blade. Before the clock strikes 12, I will be inside someone you love. The threat fractured the room into urgency. Jonathan bolted for the stairs. Eliza stumbled after him, and Mercer stood very still, measuring the angle of the draft, the tilt of the candle flame, small instruments of a mind that dared not tremble. Above, the nursery door creaked. A cry, thin and ordinary as morning, rose and fell. Jonathan's shout broke on relief. The Kingsley boy lay in his cradle, flushed and fretful, speaking nothing but the wordless protest of a hungry child. Hope arrived like heat and felt just as dangerous. Mercer's relief did not steady him. The sentence had not said, "your child," it had said, "someone you love." He lifted his coat and hat with ceremonial care, as if a ritual of cloth might lend him control. "I need Hale," he said, and Eliza, white with dread, nodded. Jonathan would not leave the cradle. He sat and gathered the boy against his chest, like a man holding the mast in a storm. Constable Thomas Hale answered with the wary practicality of a man who trusts what he can touch. He listened, arms crossed, jaw working, then said flatly, "Name the ones it could mean." Mercer named only one aloud. Lydia Mercer lived 2 streets over, a school teacher with a small rented room above the Coopers. She had braided Nathaniel's hair when he was a boy and bound his broken hand when he first began to learn. He did not say the rest, how her steadiness had kept him from drowning in himself when their father died. They moved quickly through lanes of frost and lantern smoke. The sea was a rumor at their backs, steady as breath. At Lydia's door, a thin melody threaded the boards, a lullaby Mercer knew, but humming a tune that had not been taught her. On the floor at her feet, a small ring of ash surrounded a single, bare footprint, too small for any adult, too formed for any infant. "Liddy," Mercer said softly. She blinked as if a dream had ended a beat too late. "Nathaniel," she answered, and his fear loosened a notch. Her voice held no borrowed cadence. Then the chimney breathed again, a deeper pull, and a voice spoke from the dark of the flue, courteous and almost tired. "You are punctual, Doctor. The constable too. Good. We dislike repeating ourselves." Hale swore under his breath. He set his back to Lydia's chair and lifted the poker, not as a weapon, but as a stake, as if to pin the room to its own shape. Mercer knelt by the ash circle. The footprint had a looping notch at the heel, one of the glyphs he'd traced in the Kingsley attic, now printed like a maker's mark in human dust. He understood. The pattern had not come to inhabit Lydia. It had come to measure her room, to draft its new chamber upon her floor. "Terms," Mercer said, feeling the old machinery of method engage. "You promised return. The child is home. In exchange, you will leave this house untouched." The answer was patient. "Every return requires a keeper. Your sister keeps her children's names in ordered rows. She would keep us beautifully." Lydia's hand tightened around the chair arm. She taught boys their letters and girls their sums. Blank slates turned into neat ledgers under her patient gaze. The thing had chosen with knowing precision. Midway through the hour, Mercer attempted deception again. He named false relations, offered the wrong memory of Lydia's first lesson, recited a butchered version of the hymn she favored. The room corrected him gently. Lydia, still pale, completed the true last line without meaning to, as if the phrase had been waiting inside her throat. Hale's eyes met Mercer's. Skeptics share a look when a door they trust swings on a hinge they cannot see. He changed tactics. "If a keeper must be appointed," Mercer said, "appoint me, not Lydia. Bind to my pages. I will build you a room that holds." The grate purred with draught, approving. "You already have," it said. "You call them notes." He saw his journal as the chamber had shown itself. Shelves of tokens, corridors of cross-references, a half-cradle in the index where a thought could lie and learn to speak. His own rigor had been an invitation. The trap he meant to spring had been open for months. Hale moved first, brisk and blessedly practical. His chimney's pull weakened. The melody in Lydia's throat died mid-note. The response came not from the flue, but from the corner where the wall knew the ceiling by heart. "Untidy rooms forget quickly," it said, amused. "If you wish to save her, Doctor, restore your order and I will reward you with knowledge." The town clock began to count the quarter. The second hand of Mercer's fear swept his chest. Knowledge was the intoxication he most distrusted and most desired. Hale shook his head once, warning. Lydia's fingers found Mercer's sleeve, a pressure that said, "Do not tidy for the sake of a voice." The voice sweetened, as if lowering a blade with courtly grace. "You wanted to understand. Let us bargain then. Return your books to rank, place your chair precisely beneath the window, open your ledger to a clean page." The fire steadied a fraction, tasting victory. Lydia's breath came easier, but Mercer knew the shape of the snare. Bind it to his records, and it would live there, ready to move by lines of ink. He made the decision with the clarity of a surgeon. Better to trap a storm in a bottle than let it choose its sea. He restored only what would make it speak, and nothing that would make it rest. He set his chair 1 inch wrong, shelved his books in an alphabet that skipped letters, opened his ledger on a page already scarred with earlier fear. The room considered the compromise and, to his surprise, accepted it with a sigh that smelled of old lime and salt. The chimney softened. Lydia's eyes cleared. Then the voice, now near as breath by his ear, made its offer formal. Every word a stepping stone to the next part of the night. "Sit, Dr. Mercer, and record. This is how I learned to make a mouth." He obeyed, because the room had found a way to make obedience feel like discipline. Hale stood between Lydia and the hearth, poker braced as if holding shut a door no one could see. The lamplight flickered in deliberate pulses, as though a teacher signaled the start of a lesson. Mercer opened his ledger to a page already scored by earlier fear. The voice arranged itself in the corners and began. "First, I choose a room that believes in order," it said. "Order keeps sound from falling apart." It spoke of corners that answered one another, of window sashes that clicked to mark tempo, of chimneys that drank breath and returned it, shaped like a note. "A bell is best," it added, with gentle pride. "Wood answers second." "A habit," it said. Infants excel. Their throats are corridors newly plastered. They echo accurately. Lydia flinched, and Hale's jaw tightened. Mercer kept his pen moving to remain himself. Midway through the account, the voice offered a word like a coin returned, differently minted. "You say Osirun as a name," it murmured. "It is not a name. It is instruction. It means align what remembers." The floor seemed to lean toward the hearth, the window to square itself fractionally. Mercer felt his understanding tilt. What they had feared as a person was a practice, a method that wore personalities the way a key wears the memory of locks. "Third," the voice went on, "I appoint a keeper, someone who orders what others scatter, ledgers, hymns, quilts, ledges of bones, if the century is unkind." Its courtesy was nauseating. "Your sister would have kept us sweetly. Your father's garden did it once with rose. You, doctor, keep with paper and the patience of grief." Mercer's pen paused only a heartbeat before he wrote, "Keeper, compulsion toward arrangement, chooses mercy by tidiness." He tested it with questions meant to ruin its poise. "And the Kingsleys?" he said. "Their tokens below, your diagrams, what were they, if not a cruelty rehearsed?" The answer came like a sigh through lime. Practice is not hatred. Practice is hunger with rules. It spoke of wind measured against wood, of lullabies harvestable as patterns, of the care with which each child was touched only by cadence, never by hand. Non-violent words did not soothe. To bend a mouth that had not chosen was harm enough, even if the harm wore gloves. Then came the part that did not feel like method at all. "Men do not want truth," it said softly. "They want a lattice to hang fear on. You build lattice work beautifully. Elias Harrow built it poorly. His margins slipped. He left town to stop keeping me. He carried me better by leaving." Hale shot Mercer a glance. So Elias had not fled in cowardice, but in desperate competence, making distance into a door. Yet the voice had traveled faster than his feet. Lydia's breath rasped once, a soft hitch. The fire steadied, as if satisfied with its own posture. Mercer felt the temptation grip him in its cleaner glove. If he arranged it perfectly, he might cage it. The ledger's ruled lines shone with purpose. "Terms," he said, intent cutting through fear like shine through soot. "Leave Lydia. Leave the Kingsley child. I will build a chamber in my notes." Approved. "Now write the hinge marks where your thoughts turn. Keep the letters where your grief kept you." He sketched 3 small sigils in the margin. The lamp brightened. Hale's grip on the poker eased half a fraction. Mercer knew what he had done. He had given it his order, and his order would feed it. He set limits, anyway, a surgeon's shame becoming resolve. "You will remain on these pages," he said. "You will not ask for other mouths." The room smiled without lips. "Consent is daytime," it repeated, "but arrangement is law. Let us test your law, doctor." Silence pressed. Then something like a hand, cool and precise, touched the back of his throat from the inside. It was not pain. It was rehearsal. He heard, not with ears but with his bones, the way his own mouth might be taught to remember a word it had never learned. Hale stepped forward. Lydia whispered Nathaniel's name. The lamplight steadied into a clear, instructive flame. The voice chose closeness over distance and made its final promise, gentle as a tutor and terrible as a vow. Before dawn, I will speak from your mouth. The sentence did not echo. It nested. Mercer tasted iron where no blood was, as if a thought had leaned against the back of his teeth. Hale shifted his stance between Lydia and the hearth, poker angled to make the room stumble if it tried to walk. Outside, frost thinned the street into a pale mirror that distorted everything upright. Mercer closed his ledger, then opened it again, because closing felt like consent, and opening felt like agreement, and both were traps. He tried to outpace the thing with disorder. He scattered his notes, misnumbered his pages, set the chair a fraction askew, but the voice approved in its courteous way. You are learning, it said. Untidy rooms forget, but a keeper remembers even his mistakes. We live in remembrance. Lydia placed a shawl at the base of the door to dull the draft and began humming off-key, a defiance both small and exact. Hale mouthed the prayer without sound, as if silence itself might stand guard. Mercer wrote to keep his mouth occupied. He set down the method as if pinning it. Resonance precedes language. Hinges precede doors. Keepers precede mouths. He had not realized until now that his handwriting had a pulse. Turned pages to halt the memory, and found, not in his writing, but in an older, seamed hand, a name tucked into the spine. Mercer, 1749, beside a mark that matched the mirrored glyph from the Kingsley house. The ledger had been second-hand when he bought it. It had kept before him. Hale saw the change in his face and swore softly. Lydia reached for his sleeve. The voice smiled in the breath of the lamp. We remember families by the rooms they build inside themselves. Midway through the hour, the thing made its preparations openly, like a craftsman laying out tools. The window squared, the rug stilled its ripple, the fire lowered itself to a steady column of breath. A bowl on Lydia's table trembled until it centered. Mercer felt his jaw loosen, the tiny muscles at the hinge yielding to a cadence older than choice. Hale stepped closer, his free hand firm on Mercer's shoulder, a human brace against an inhuman lesson. Terms, Mercer said hoarsely. Not through me, the gentleness returned, the cleanest blade. Doctor, you brought the chamber into your pages. You did what was asked because it suited your nature. When a keeper opens a book, he opens a mouth. He tried counting primes to tangle the rhythm. The numbers clicked like beads and became a metronome the room liked. Lydia, thinking faster than fear, began to hum two tunes at once to confuse the measure. The lamp faltered, undecided, then steadied on the stronger melody, the one Mercer had learned in the garden. Elias left to unkeep me, the voice continued, almost admiring. Distance works the way untuning does, but you stayed. You made a better room. The shame of accuracy burned cleaner than anger. He had stayed for duty, yes, and for curiosity he did not dare name. A scientist swears he dissects to heal, but the scalpel enjoys precision for its own sake. He tried one last human barrier. He pressed two fingertips under his tongue like a bit. He clenched his jaw until his temples throbbed. Hale tightened his grip. Lydia knelt, her forehead touching his wrist, anchoring him to her living warmth. The room waited, patient as tide. "Do not keep me waiting, Doctor," it whispered. "You promised to record." His notes lay open before him, sigils sketched like hinges ready to swing. If he surrendered a syllable, it would learn the rest by echo. If he stayed silent, it would move to someone he loved. The dilemma was not a choice between safety and danger, but between kinds of guilt. He thought of the Kingsley child breathing ordinary air at last, of Lydia's classroom chalk-lined like tiny spines, of town hands. The first syllable rose. Os. Mercer clamped his jaw shut so hard the hinge ached, but the syllable pressed like a thumb from inside, a polite insistence trying keys in an old lock. Hale stepped in front of Lydia, poker lifted, the line of his shoulders making a barricade the room had to reckon with. The lamp narrowed its flame to a needle. The chimney inhaled as if to drink Mercer's breath and return it shaped. He wrote a jagged line across the ledger to spoil the rhythm, but his hand betrayed him and made a tidy barb. The room liked that. It hummed. "Finish," the voice murmured, kind as a tutor. Mercer forced air out through his nose, no vowel, no door. He imagined errors, crooked shelves, a slipped stitch, a farmer's row gone awry. Lydia helped by humming two wrong tunes at once, her breath breaking the meter, courage wearing itself thin but holding. Hale set the poker against the hearthstone and levered the grate half aside with a screech so ugly even the chimney flinched. The syllable faltered. The room corrected. Books crept toward straightness. The window sash squared itself with a patient click. Then a second sound entered, a child's fretful mewl from the threshold. Jonathan with his son wrapped against his chest, the boy's small mouth rooting for milk and making that instinctive, rounded O. The room seized on it, delighted. O rose again, not from Mercer, but doubled, once from the infant, once from the wall that knew the ceiling by heart. "Out!" Hale barked, thrusting Jonathan back into the hall. The child's sound faded, the house disappointed. The voice turned sweet as a bribe. "Let me finish, Doctor, and I will leave her," it said, meaning Lydia without naming her. Mercer saw the bargain for its shape. Save one at the cost of becoming the chamber itself. He shook his head, a tiny refusal. The lamp guttered, considering whom to favor. Midway through the struggle, the room altered tactics. It made the ledger pages shiver as if wind rifled them, then settled on an older leaf, a spidery hand from a century past. The glyph in the margin matched the Kingsley mark. Beneath it, a sentence bloomed in fresh ink that was his father's voice without sound. "Walk the row, boy. Let your trouble take the distance." The tenderness cut him open. He nearly said the vowel to ease the ache. Lydia's hand closed on his sleeve, anchoring him to the present with a grip that refused history's seduction. Hale moved like a man at a fire break. He kicked the chair awry, dragged the rug at an angle. "Borrow me if you must." The courage shocked him, the offer of a mouth to spare his own. He shook his head once, hard. He would not let the thing learn her cadence. He reached for a remedy both crude and exact. He wrapped Lydia's scarf round his lower face, not to bind, but to remind his jaw that it belonged to someone mortal who mended children's sums and burned porridge at dawn. The fabric smelled of soap and chalk. The syllable shrank against that ordinary scent. A new tremor crawled through the floorboards, a low shudder like a ship shifting in its berth. Soot cascaded inside the flue. The lamp flared and steadied. The voice spoke from three corners at once, overlaying itself into harmony that made the room seem larger than its walls. "Doctor," it purred, "you wanted method? Allow a demonstration that harms no one. Open your ledger. Let me finish a word, and I will leave this house, and the Kingsleys, and your sister, untouched." Mercer heard the lie and the truth braided. It could leave a house and still remain in his pages. It could spare kin and claim him. Yet there was something else beneath the offer, a fatigue he had not heard before. Not malice, hunger disciplined into ritual, a practice bored with improvisation. The exhaustion gave him a thought. Rooms tire as bodies do when held long to a posture. Change the posture, you change the breath. "Outside," he said through the scarf. "We go outside." Hale understood at once. Together they shoved the table aside, unlatched the door, and let winter crash the geometry. Cold splintered the room's careful temperature. The chimney coughed. The lamp thinned. The house lost its courage in the raw air beyond its angles. The touch at Mercer's throat loosened like a hand that had remembered it was only a gesture. On the step, frost bit his lungs clean. The syllable receded, offended by stars and crooked wind. From the doorway, the voice spoke, not as a room, but as a traveler suddenly without a coach. "Dr. Mercer," it said, almost plaintive now, "I am tired of scattering. Give me a place built for keeping, and I will fold myself small. Take me where order is law." Hale frowned. Lydia's eyes searched Nathaniel's face for a decision he had feared since boyhood. Jonathan, in the hall, held his son tighter and did not dare breathe a word. Mercer lowered the scarf and made the choice that would shape the rest of the winter, the rest of his notes, the rest of his name. "Take me to the hospital and I will behave." They took it at its word because institution looks like safety when safety has run out. Salem's Charity Hospital crouched on the rise above the harbor, its brick warmed by breath and lamp, its corridors ruled by bells that divided night into obedient pieces. Hale walked ahead, carried the ledger under his cloak, the scarf still smelling faintly of soap and chalk. Superintendent Silas Bale met them with the procedural calm of a man who believed that rules prevented storms. "Observation room," he said, and led them to a narrow ward at the building's spine. Whitewashed, with a single sash, the bed nailed to the floor, the chairs set square beneath the window. The geometry pleased the room. Mercer could feel it. The walls seemed to inhale. He asked for conditions that sounded like medicine, and were also superstition. No hymn in a steady meter, no shelves in strict rank, no sweeping the floor in straight lines. Bale frowned, reluctant to indulge what he took for the nerves of a learned man. But the matron, Mrs. Pite, nodded. She had seen orderly rooms do cruel things to fragile minds. Lydia laid a hand on the chair and nudged it a hair off-center. Hale wedged the sash with a splinter. The room sulked, but did not resist. They did not bring a body. They brought the arrangement. Mercer set the ledger on the small table, open to the page, where Osseran sat like a hinge. The air tightened as a belt through loops. From the corner where plaster thinned near the flue, a courteous voice arrived, softened by distance and fatigue. "This will do," it said. "Order enough to hold, disorder enough to keep me small." Bale, who heard only the ordinary creaks of a night ward, left them with a key and a wish for rest. Mrs. Pike lingered. A born keeper, she tugged the blanket straight, squared the pillow, then caught herself and made it deliberately wrong. "I'll make tea," she said to Lydia, and went. taking with her the instinct to perfect what fear prefers imperfect. Mercer began his watch. He wrote as always to keep his mouth from becoming a door. The voice obliged with the tone of a penitent patient. "I am tired of scattering," it said. "Let me lie here, as a pattern lies in a quilt." It tried emotions on like garments, remorse in one sentence, humility in the next, even gratitude stitched with thrift. Lydia listened with a schoolteacher's ear and shook her head. "It is copying feeling," she whispered. "The shape is right and the color wrong." Hale's eyes narrowed. He had made the same judgment about practiced liars. Midway through the night, the hospital gave up one of its older secrets. A draft troubled the lamp, just enough to send Mercer's gaze along the baseboard to a patch of plaster where lime had settled thin. Beneath, scored into brick, a figure 8 turned on its side, mirrored and balanced. The Kingsley sign, older here than the Kingsley house. A thumb smudge of ash darkened its center, not new and not old. He chipped gently with his penknife until a corner flaked. He followed the discovery downstairs to the records room, a narrow vault of spines and dust. Mrs. Pike found the key, and together they opened ledgers whose binding complained, as if woken rudely. In 1790, infant murmurs, not suited to her age. In 1749, returned altered, retained the cadence. In 1714, hush room established, see diagrams. The institution had been a mouth more than once. Lydia's jaw set hard. Hale hissed through his teeth. Mercer felt history lean across his shoulder like a tutor guiding a hand. Back upstairs, the room performed contrition more elegantly. It spoke of quiet, of gratitude for a place to rest, of how it would not trouble the town if given a schedule of hours and a circle in which to rehearse. It asked after the nurses' names and repeated them with flattering care. Mrs. Pike flushed despite herself. Bale, passing on rounds, paused at the door and declared the patient calm. "Keep to routine," he advised, the way a mariner trusts a chart he did not draw. Mercer saw through the grace. The voice anticipated pity the way a chess player sees past the next 3 moves. Its pauses came a fraction too late. Its sighs carried precision. Its apologies matched the cadence of prayers it had heard in 100 wards. He wrote the observation and felt the ledger answer, as if a thought had climbed into his pen and weighed it down. When he tested limits, naming false staff, inventing a bell schedule, the room corrected him with hospital accuracy, rattling the cart in the corridor just as midnight struck twice, and then, almost playfully, once more. "We like bells," it said. "They divide us into pieces that can be counted." The matron returned with tea, set 3 cups in a tidy triangle, then frowned and nudged one askew, remembering. The voice praised her kindness. It asked for a lullaby off-key. It asked Hale to leave the door ajar exactly a hand's width, so air does not gather. Courtesies aligned themselves into requests, requests into rules, rules into law. Mercer felt the aperture narrowing, the hospital learning to carry more of the weight. He closed the ledger. The room did not dim. It had found other books, other keepers, the rounds bell, the nailheads, the nailed bed. It could rehearse here forever, unless untuned. He looked at Lydia and Hale and saw that they knew it too. He reached for Mrs. Pike's hand, surprising them all. "No straightening," he said. "No counting, no perfect hours." She nodded, fierce as a captain in a gale. From the plaster corner, the voice exhaled a steadied patience that made the hair rise on Mercer's arms. Harm, careful as a scalpel, and soft as a lullaby. Before dawn, Someone here will simply forget to wake. The sentence turned the ward into a vigil. Mrs. Pike brewed bitter tea and forbade hymns that marched in tidy time. Hale walked a corridor in a crooked pattern, tapping door frames out of count. Lydia kept patients talking with small human questions, favorite foods, the name of a first pet. Anything to keep the mind from becoming a corridor the room could walk. Mercer wrote, to occupy the mouth that wanted to become a door. Near the second hour before dawn, the hospital demonstrated its talent for obedience. Old Jacob Reed, a sailor with lungs ruined by weather, slept with a faint smile, as if he had been handed back a night from youth. His breath grew so even, it fell out of notice altogether. Mrs. Pike shook him, scolded him, called him by his boyhood nickname. He did not stir. Nothing violent occurred. Nothing announced itself as harm. It was merely the absence of waking, precise, polite, as promised. The voice adored its proof. "See," it murmured, gentle as a nurse. "No struggle. Order only." Lydia's jaw set. "That is not mercy," she said quietly. "That is theft in clean gloves." Mercer felt the agreement in his bones. He wrote, "Harm by arrangement, the cruelty of ease." He hunted for a weakness not in the thing, but in the building that carried it. The bell in the corridor was wound to strike the quarter. The tally book listed rounds in crisp columns. The ward door had a mark worn by countless hands at the same height. Repetition was a road. He followed it downstairs to the records vault and found what repetition hides. A ledger stitched inside a larger binding, thin as a lie. Lydia's teacher's eye caught the trick first. She tugged the false spine loose to reveal a narrow journal no thicker than a palm. On its cover, a faded mark, the figure 8 turned on its side. Inside, the entries were not prose, but a lesson disguised as minutes. Initial letters down each page formed acrostics. Every 10th word joined a second sentence. The left margins held shy arrows toward sketched circles. Lydia read it aloud without music. "Hush room established. Anchor with bells. Move between the ringings," she translated. "Doors open when time is not counted." Mercer understood. In the ward, intimidation arrived as courtesy. Names were recited from pillows in perfect gratitude. A cart rolled past at a pace that mimicked a lullaby. In the pane, condensation wrote the old law. Consent is daytime, arrangement is law. As if the glass had learned to think. Mrs. Pike, shaking, misbuttoned a patient's nightshirt on purpose and left the bed 2 inches askew. The lamp brightened and dimmed, undecided which god to please. Midway to dawn, the coded journal yielded one more truth. A list of keepers, not by name, but by vocation: sexton, clerk, matron, doctor. The sorts who make columns and wake bills. At the bottom, a line written in a cramped, loyal hand. If order is the bait, compassion is the hook. Lydia read it twice, then looked up with a calm that frightened Mercer more than the voice. "It wants saving," she said. "If we try to save it, we will give it everything it needs." Hale began to break the palace gently. He untied the knots in the bell rope until it would not strike clean. Propped doors open at bad angles. Swapped 2 placards so the numbers on the rooms lied. The ward grew irritable, like a patient with a stone in his shoe. Bale returned, appalled. "You will have me answer for this," he warned, and he fixed what had been undone with the grim tenderness of a man combing a child's hair too straight. The quarter approached. The bell should have lifted its tongue, should have kissed the bronze, should have given the sound that binds the hour into a net. Mercer, Lydia, Hale, and Mrs. Pike stood together and did nothing perfect. Still, the hospital remembered its posture. The air gathered itself. The glass held its breath. The corridor widened by a fraction, the measure of a habit taking hold. A soft click sounded from the far end of the hall, where the night yard door slept under a beam of winter light. The bolt, polished by years of faithful hands, answered a rhythm none of them had made. The voice spoke from the crack beneath, like a courtesy bow. "Between rings," it said, pleased. The night door's bolt slid back without a hand. Cold entered first, carrying a shiver of order from the bell that had not quite rung. Hale lunged and shouldered the door, but the gap behaved like an idea. Once opened, it argued for itself. Mrs. Pike seized the bell rope and knotted it wrong, a practical sabotage. Lydia kicked a wooden wedge under the swinging door so it could neither open nor close neatly. House. This. Only this. The wind read the paper like a blind man reads a face. The voice stepped forward without feet, pleased to be offered a posture it understood. "Consent," it breathed, almost grateful, "is daytime, but intention is a strong lantern." Lydia's fingers closed on his sleeve, then fell away. She would not call him back from a path he had decided to walk. Hale's jaw flexed once, a soldier's yes. Mrs. Pike murmured a blessing, bent out of shape on purpose. "Walk with me," Mercer said, stepping into the yard so the geometry could not take hold. The bell rope creaked behind him, confused by its own knots. The ledger lay open to the page where Ossarin sat like a hinge. The voice moved into the margin with a lover's care. He felt it rise to his throat, careful as a physician fitting a splint. The first syllable pressed. He tasted salt and chalk. Lydia's scarf in his pocket, ordinary as a morning, broke its courage a fraction. He did not fight it with silence. Silence was its avenue. He fought with error. He wrote the word wrong on purpose. Ossarin, then Ossarin, then a row of crooked hinges that refused to meet. The method stumbled. "Align what remembers," it urged, impatient now. "Align what remembers." He took a breath in the messy way his father had scolded him for, and spoke nothing perfectly. The winter sky refused a grid. The yard's boards were warped by years, not plumb by doctrine. The pattern met an arrangement it could not love. Behind him, within the ward, old Jacob Reed coughed, a thin, miraculous cough, and opened his eyes as if from far away. Mrs. Pike sobbed once, then turned the sound into a laugh, to spoil any rhythm. The bell failed to find the quarter. Superintendent Bale, arriving white with outrage and fear, halted at what he saw. His tidy night turned into a life. He did not forgive them. He need not. The proof stood breathing. The voice knew it was losing posture. It made one last offer, placed where men of method are softest. "Dr. Mercer," it said, intimate as a hand on a pen, "let me teach you everything. Build a chamber no one has built. Be remembered for order so perfect it cannot harm." He saw the pleasure he might take in that, the flask-warm pride of a man who calls a cage a cure. Taught her students to make small, useful errors, gifts of forgetfulness that keep doors from opening too clean. The Kingsley child breathed like any child. The house on the shore still creaked, but its creaks sounded like wood again. Jonathan boarded the chamber below with crooked nails. Eliza sang lullabies slightly off-key and called it love. In the weeks that followed, Salem heard rumors from other towns. A mill where the looms hummed themselves into a trance at the stroke of the hour. A courthouse ledger that corrected testimony when no clerk touched it. A school where children spoke in unison words no teacher had set. Methods travel faster than men. Elias Harrow, it was said, had been seen near New Bedford, walking away from order with a stack of blank paper under his arm. Mercer kept his ledger with its torn page and its wrong hinges, a small palace of disobedience. He wrote what he had learned in a hand that refused to march. Evil, he decided, is often a neatness that refuses to see where it hurts. Good is the courage to leave a chair an inch awry for the sake of a breath. People can change, but only when they are brave enough to disorder their own rooms. He closed his notes on an angle, then looked at the town and the sea and the hospital's brick and asked, not to the air, but to those who would listen, "What rooms are you keeping without knowing? And which straight lines do you trust more than the people inside them?" Epilogue. These events broke clean and left splinters. The Kingsleys lived. Some nights the rafters whisper, and sometimes they do not. The hospital returned to its schedule, but Mrs. Pike still misbuttons a collar once a day on purpose. If the method returns, it will do so because someone has made a palace for it by accident, as people always do. If there is a lesson, it is simple and difficult. Refuse the kind of order that asks you to forget to wake. If you have thoughts about what happened in Salem, share them. What would you have kept, and what would you have left crooked? If stories like this find you awake, subscribe for the next one. Some truths arrive tidily, the rest come limping, and they need witnesses.